Welcome. You're listening to the History Podcast for Sleep. Tonight's episode is about how ancient Egyptians relaxed after work. There is no urgency here. There is nothing you need to remember. There is nothing that will be on a test. This is simply a very long, very calm, very thorough exploration of what people did in ancient Egypt when the workday was finished. You do not need to stay awake for any of it. In fact, we encourage the opposite. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw go loose. And just listen, softly, as we begin. The ancient Egyptians had a word for relaxation, though it was not exactly a word that translated neatly into modern English. They had a general sense of returning to oneself after the obligations of the day had been fulfilled. This sense was felt most deeply in the late afternoon, when the sun had passed its highest point and had begun its slow, unhurried descent toward the western horizon. In ancient Egyptian cosmology, the west was where the sun went to rest. And so, in a quiet way, the act of relaxing at the end of the day was connected to something much larger. It was an alignment with the movement of the sun itself. We will be spending a great deal of time this evening discussing very ordinary things. We will talk about bread. We will talk about sitting down. We will talk about the particular quality of light in the late afternoon in a river valley in northeastern Africa several thousand years ago. We will talk about sandals being removed and set beside a door. We will talk about the sound of water being poured into a clay cup. None of these things are dramatic. All of them are real. And together they form a picture of daily life that is, in its own way, remarkably soothing. Let us begin at the very beginning of the after-work period. The workday in ancient Egypt typically ended when the heat of the afternoon became too intense to continue, or when the task at hand had been completed, or when the particular light shifted in a way that signalled it was time to stop. For farmers, this might be when the soil became too hard and dry to turn effectively. For craftsmen, it might be when the light coming through the workshop window grew too dim to see fine details. For scribes, it might simply be when the text they had been copying reached a natural pause. The end of work was not always announced. It was often simply felt. When an Egyptian worker finished their day, the first thing many of them did was walk. This was not a purposeful, energetic walk. It was a slow, meandering movement through the village or town toward home. The paths were dusty, lined sometimes with low, mud brick walls, sometimes with palm trees that cast long, thin shadows in the late afternoon. The air smelled of the Nile, which was never very far away. That particular smell of water and silt and green reeds that defined Egyptian life from the earliest settlements to the latest dynasties. People passed each other on these paths. They nodded. Sometimes they said something brief. Often they said nothing at all, simply acknowledging one another with a slight change in posture, a small lift of the chin. The homes that workers returned to were modest by the standards of the pharaohs and high officials, but they were real homes with real comforts. A typical worker's house in a place like Deir el-Medina, the village built for the craftsmen who worked on the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, consisted of several rooms arranged in a line. There was an entrance room, which was often the most public space of the house. Then there was a main living area, which was usually slightly elevated above street level, allowing for a bit more air circulation and privacy. Behind that were storage rooms and sometimes a small kitchen area, and above everything, accessible by a small staircase or a simple ladder, was the roof. The roof of an Egyptian house was not simply a structural element, it was a living space. In the long, dry seasons, when the air was warm and still, people would sleep on their roofs, eat on their roofs, sit in the evenings on their roofs and watch the sky darken from a deep burning orange to a rich, velvety purple-black, filled with more stars than most people who live in lit cities today have ever seen. The roof was where the day ended. It was, in a very literal sense, the place where people went to decompress. Now, let us slow down even further. Let us follow one particular person, a craftsman, on one particular evening somewhere around 1250 BCE in the village of Deir el-Medina. He has spent the day in the Valley of the Kings, cutting stone and applying paint to the interior walls of a tomb that will one day hold a person of great importance. The work has been careful, precise, and physically demanding. His arms are tired, his eyes are tired from working in the flickering light of oil lamps in the narrow, low corridors of the tomb. He's carrying a small bag with a few of his tools. He walks down the path from the valley along a route he has walked so many times that his feet know the way without any conscious direction from his mind. The path slopes gently downward. There are a few other workers ahead of him, a few behind. Nobody is speaking much. The sun is getting lower. The limestone cliffs to the west are glowing with a pale gold light that is very beautiful, and that nobody remarks upon, because it happens every evening and there is nothing unusual about it. When he arrives at his house, he removes his sandals at the door. This is a habitual action, nearly automatic, and yet it carries a small but real significance. The sandals are work sandals, tied with leather thongs, slightly stiff with dust and sweat. Removing them is a physical act of crossing from one state into another. Outside is work. Inside, or at least inside the threshold of home, is something else. He sets the sandals beside the door and steps inside. The floor of his entrance room is packed, earth covered in places with woven reed mats. The room is cool compared to the outside, not dramatically cool, but noticeably so, the way a shadow feels cool when you step out of direct sun. There is a simple wooden stool near the wall. He sits on it for a moment and simply exists. He does not do anything. He does not look at anything in particular. He just sits and lets the stillness of the room settle around him. This too is a form of relaxation that ancient Egyptians would have understood without needing to name it. After a few minutes, he moves to the main room of the house. His wife is there, and there may be children, and there is the sound of something being prepared in the back of the house. Perhaps bread, perhaps a lentil stew with garlic and cumin, perhaps simply water being poured. The sounds of domestic life are across all of human history and in every culture among the most reliably soothing sounds available. The soft thud of something being set down on a flat surface. The murmur of voices at a volume that implies no urgency. The creak of a reed mat being shifted. Water was important. After a day of physical labour in the Egyptian heat, the washing of hands and face and feet was not simply a hygienic act, though it was certainly that too. It was a ritual of transition. There were small basins in Egyptian homes, and water would have been brought from the Nile or from the irrigation channels, sometimes carried in large clay jars balanced on the head or slung from a wooden yoke across the shoulders. The water was not cold, but it was cooler than the air, and the sensation of it on dusty skin was pleasant in a way that was both physical and psychological. Let us talk for a moment about the water of the Nile, because it is relevant to everything in ancient Egyptian life. The Nile was not simply a river, it was the organizing principle of Egyptian civilization. Everything depended on it. The agriculture, the transportation, the irrigation, the very concept of the calendar, which was divided into 3 seasons based on the Nile's behavior. The flood season, called Akhet, when the Nile rose and covered the agricultural land with the rich, dark silt that made Egypt so fertile. The growing season, called Pereh, when the water receded and the fields became workable, and the dry season, called Shemu, when the crops were harvested and the land waited again for the flood. In the evenings, the Nile had a particular quality. The light reflected off the water in long, broken shimmers. The reeds along the banks rustled with the small evening breeze that came from the north. Reliably, almost every day, one of the great regularities of Egyptian life that people counted on without thinking much about it. There were birds. There were always birds near the Nile, herons standing motionless in the shallows, ducks moving in unhurried formations through the backwaters, the occasional ibis, which was sacred and which moved with a kind of ceremonious deliberateness that seemed almost consciously calm. In the homes, once the washing was done and the tools were set aside, the next order of business was often food. Egyptian workers were, by the standards of the ancient world, reasonably well fed. The state provided standard rations to workers like our craftsmen. Bread and beer were the staples, and these were supplemented by vegetables, legumes, occasionally fish, sometimes meat on special occasions or feast days. The bread was dense and filling, made from emmer wheat or barley, baked in clay moulds or flat on hot stones. It was not the light, airy bread of modern bakeries. It was a bread that sat in the stomach with a comfortable solidity, the kind of food that signals to the body that the work is done and it is time to slow down. Beer in ancient Egypt deserves its own extended discussion, because it was central to daily life in a way that modern people sometimes find surprising. Egyptian beer was not exactly like modern beer. It was thick, nutritious, and relatively low in alcohol compared to modern brews, though it was certainly alcoholic enough to have a relaxing effect when consumed at the end of a long day. It was made by fermenting bread in water, a process that produced a murky, slightly sour liquid that was both a food and a drink. Workers strained it through woven baskets to remove the largest chunks of bread, but it was never perfectly clear. It was consumed in large ceramic vessels, sometimes through reed straws to avoid the sediment at the bottom. The flavour of Egyptian beer would not appeal to everyone today. It was thick, slightly sour, and had a yeasty richness that was more like a thin porridge than what most modern drinkers would recognise as beer. But it was filling, it was nutritious, it contained B vitamins and other nutrients from the fermentation process, and it had exactly the effect that workers at the end of a long day were looking for. A cup or two in the evening, sitting in the relative coolness of the main room or on the roof, watching the last of the light leave the sky, had been a comfort to Egyptian workers for thousands of years before our craftsman was born. and would continue to be so for thousands of years after. Let us now spend some time with the roof. We keep returning to it because it is so central to the Egyptian evening experience. The roofs of Deir el-Medina houses were flat, made of wooden beams and packed mud, sometimes reinforced with straw. They were not particularly soft surfaces, but Egyptians slept on wooden or woven reed platforms even indoors, and their relationship to what constituted a comfortable sleeping surface was different from the modern relationship. A reed mat on a flat roof, under a sky so thick with stars it almost seemed to have texture, was not a deprivation. It was, for much of the year, simply where sleep happened. The sky over Egypt in antiquity was darker than almost any sky most modern people have ever experienced. There were no city lights, no electric glow on the horizon, no satellites moving steadily across the field of stars. The Milky Way was visible as a broad, luminous band stretched from horizon to horizon, and it was not merely visible but spectacular. The kind of view that, when modern people encounter it for the first time in genuinely dark places, tends to produce a silence and a stillness that feels almost involuntary. The ancient Egyptians saw this every clear night of their lives. It was not remarkable to them. It was simply the sky. Egyptian cosmology organized the sky in ways that made the act of lying on a roof and looking up not merely relaxing but theologically grounding. The sky was a goddess named Nut, who arched her body over the earth, her fingers and toes touching the 4 cardinal directions, her belly spangled with stars. The sun travelled across her body during the day and through her body during the night to be reborn each morning. The Milky Way was sometimes understood as her body itself. Looking up at the night sky was, in a literal sense, looking at a divine being. We should also talk about children in the evenings, because they were very much present in the houses of Egyptian workers, and their presence shaped the rhythms of the evening in ways both familiar and particular to their time. Egyptian children played. This is abundantly clear from the archaeological record, which has preserved toys, wooden animals with moving mouths, small balls made of leather or clay, spinning tops, dolls with hair made of strings of beads. In the evenings, before sleep, children in Egyptian households would have played, or listened to stories, or simply been present in that noisy, energetic way of children who do not yet understand that adults are tired. The stories that Egyptian adults told children have mostly been lost to us, but we have fragments. We have written tales that survived on papyrus and ostraca, the flat limestone chips on which scribes and students practiced writing and on which even ordinary people sometimes recorded things they found interesting. We have the tale of Sinuhe, a long narrative about a court official who flees Egypt after hearing news of a king's death and who spends years in foreign lands before returning home. We have the shipwrecked sailor, a strange and poetic account of a man stranded on a magical island. We have wisdom literature, collections of sayings and advice meant to guide behaviour. Whether these written stories were also told orally, in the homes of workers in the evenings, we cannot say with certainty, but the impulse to tell stories in the evening, to give the experiences of the day and the anxieties of the night a narrative frame, is as old as human beings, and there is no reason to think ancient Egyptians were any different. Someone, somewhere, in a house in Deir el-Medina or Memphis or Thebes or any of the hundreds of towns along the Nile, was telling a story to a child who was slowly, gradually, not entirely willingly, falling asleep. Let us move now to the question of music. Music was present in ancient Egyptian life in ways that are well documented. We have representations of musicians in tomb paintings. We have the instruments themselves, harps of various sizes, including tall, beautifully decorated standing harps that would have been the province of professional musicians and the wealthy, and smaller, portable harps that ordinary people might have played. We have flutes and oboes made from reed. We have clappers made from ivory or bone, held in the hands and struck together to keep rhythm. We have sistrums, the rattling percussion instruments associated with the goddess Hathor, whose domain included music and love and festivity. Whether music was part of the typical evening in a worker's household, we can only speculate. Professional musicians existed, and they performed at temples and at the houses of the wealthy, at festivals and at funerals. But whether ordinary people played instruments for themselves in the evenings, we have less direct evidence. It seems likely that they did, at least sometimes, because people everywhere and in all times tend to make music when they can, and the instruments that existed were not all large or expensive or professionally oriented. A reed flute could be made by anyone with access to reeds, which in Egypt meant essentially everyone. If there was music in the evenings in the homes of workers, it would have been quiet music, most likely. The kind of music that is made when someone is tired but not quite ready to sleep, when the fingers move through familiar patterns almost without direction, when the sound produced is less a performance and more a continuation of the day's natural sounds, the wind in the reeds, the water in the irrigation channels, the distant call of a night bird. We should also, because we have committed to being thorough, spend some time with the medical and practical realities of relaxation in ancient Egypt. Life expectancy was not high by modern standards. Physical labour was demanding and often injurious. The work of cutting stone and hauling heavy loads left marks on the bodies of Egyptian workers that we can see clearly in the skeletal remains. Worn vertebrae, arthritic joints, healed fractures in arms and hands and feet. The bodies of Egyptian workers were not in perfect condition at the end of the day. They hurt. We know that ancient Egyptians had a sophisticated medical tradition. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest known medical documents in the world, contains hundreds of prescriptions and treatments for various conditions, including treatments for pain. Some of these treatments were effective in ways we would recognize. Willow bark, which contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, was used as an analgesic. Castor oil was used as a laxative and a topical treatment. Various herbal preparations were applied to wounds and sore muscles. Whether our craftsmen, returning home with aching arms, would have had access to any of these treatments we cannot say. But the knowledge existed, and it was not confined to the wealthy. Massage, or something functionally equivalent to it, was known in ancient Egypt. Tomb paintings show scenes that have been interpreted as therapeutic touch, and the manipulation of the body for purposes of comfort and healing appears in various medical texts. Whether this was a luxury available only to the elite, or whether wives and family members practiced informal versions of it for one another, is not definitively established by the record. But the human instinct to rub a sore muscle or press a painful joint is not culturally specific. It requires no training, only hands and a willingness to help. Let us now return to our craftsman on his roof. The sun has fully set. The sky has gone from that last deep blue to true darkness. The stars are out in their full abundance. He is lying on a reed mat, and he has pulled a light linen sheet over himself, because even in warm Egypt, the evenings in the desert valley could be cool, especially in the months that we would call autumn and spring. He is not fully asleep yet. He is in that state between wakefulness and sleep that is, perhaps, the most comfortable of all the states available to a human being. The body is heavy, the mind is slow. Thoughts move through it at the pace of clouds. What might he be thinking about? We cannot know, of course. The inner lives of people who lived 3,000 years ago are not recorded anywhere, at least not in ways that allow us to access the particular thoughts of a particular worker on a particular evening. But we can make some gentle inferences. He might be thinking about the work done that day, the passage of paint across stone, the particular corner of the tomb chamber they had reached, the way the pigment had gone on smooth or rough. He might be thinking about something someone had said to him during the day, a joke, a piece of news, a mild disagreement about the best way to do something. He might be thinking about the festival coming up, or the one that had recently passed. Festivals were important in Egyptian life. They were frequent, they were genuinely celebratory, and they provided the punctuation marks in the long, regular rhythm of work. At a major festival, there would be processions and music. There would be extra food and drink provided by the state or the temple. There would be dancing and perhaps theatrical performances of stories from the mythological tradition. Festivals were not the end of relaxation. They were a different kind of relaxation, louder and more communal than the evening on the roof, but equally real. The festival calendar in ancient Egypt was remarkably full. Almost every month had at least one significant observance, often several. There were festivals for the major deities. Amun, whose great festival at Karnak included the movement of the divine statue from one temple to another on a sacred boat carried through the streets. Hathor, whose festivals were associated with music and joy. Osiris, whose festival was connected to the agricultural cycle and the mystery of death and rebirth. There were local festivals specific to particular villages and towns, celebrations of events and deities that mattered to that particular community. For workers like those at Deir el-Medina, there were also legally mandated days off. The records from that village show that workers received rest days on a rotating basis, and that festivals were observed as holidays. The documents are remarkably detailed. We have lists of work days and rest days, records of absences and the reasons given for them. The reasons for absence given in these records include illness, of course, but also some that are more surprising to a modern reader. His mother was ill. He was brewing beer. His wife was bleeding. He was building his house. He was bitten by a scorpion. These reasons were apparently accepted without comment. Life interfered with work. It always has. On the days when there was no work, the rhythm of the day was different. Without the need to walk to the valley and spend the day underground in the flicker of oil lamps, the hours opened up in a way that had no modern equivalent in the lives of most working people. There were no devices to fill the time. There was no constant information demanding attention. There was the village and the people in it, and the tasks that needed doing at home, and the particular quality of a day when no particular thing was required. Some of those days would have been spent on domestic work, repairs to the house, maintenance of tools, work in a small kitchen garden if one was kept, the grinding of grain, the weaving of linen. These tasks were work in their own right, but they were different from tomb work. They were done at home, in daylight, with no one supervising, at a pace that could be adjusted to the mood and the energy of the person doing them. There is a quality to domestic work when it is not done under duress that is not entirely unpleasant. The rhythmic repetition of grinding grain, for instance, which required a steady back and forth motion with a stone quern, was physically demanding but regular in a way that could be almost meditative. We have, from the village of Deir el-Medina, an unusually rich archaeological record that gives us glimpses into the personal lives of the workers and their families that we simply do not have from most ancient sites. This is partly because the village was deliberately created and maintained by the state, which kept careful records. But it is also because the dry desert conditions preserved things that would have been lost in a more humid environment. We have letters written on ostraca between villagers. We have legal disputes. We have records of trade between neighbours. We have love poems. The love poems of ancient Egypt are particularly worth dwelling on in this context, because they give us direct access to the emotional life of people who lived 3,000 years ago in ways that most historical documents do not. The poems describe the experience of longing, of attraction, of the particular happiness of being with someone you love. They describe the heart beating faster, the inability to sleep, the way the beloved person's face appears in the mind unbidden. They describe the sweetness of evening time spent together, the particular pleasure of being in the same space as someone you love when the day's work is over. One poem describes a young man who cannot sleep because he is thinking of a young woman. His heart races, he says, when he thinks of her love. Another describes a young woman who sees her beloved from a distance and feels her heart stop. These are recognizable emotions. They are the same emotions that appear in every love tradition, in every culture. That they appear in ancient Egyptian texts written by workers and students and ordinary people tells us something important. The emotional texture of human life has not changed in 3,000 years. The setting is different, the details are different, but the essential experience is the same. And so, when we imagine our craftsman on his roof, we can allow him a full inner life. He is not a simplified figure, not a representative of a vanished culture. He is a person. He has preferences and memories and relationships and small anxieties and quiet satisfactions. He knows which stars rise first in the evening and what they mean in the calendar his civilization has been refining for centuries. He knows the sound of his village at night, the particular quiet of it that is different from the quiet of the valley where the tombs are. He knows the smell of the evening air, the feel of the reed mat under him, the weight of the linen sheet. He is tired, he is comfortable, and he is almost asleep. Let us now spend some time with the specific animals that would have been present in and around Egyptian homes in the evenings, because this is the kind of specific sensory detail that helps us really inhabit a time and place. Cats were famously associated with ancient Egypt, and for good reason. Domestic cats, or their ancestors, were present in Egyptian settlements from very early periods. They were valued initially because they controlled rodents in the grain stores, and later they became genuinely beloved domestic animals with a spiritual significance connected to the goddess Bastet. A cat in a worker's home at Deir el-Medina would have been a real presence in the evening, a warm, independent creature that might sit near the lamp or on the roof, indifferent to everything but entirely part of the domestic landscape. Dogs were also present. We have many representations of dogs in Egyptian art, and from the records of Deir el-Medina we know that workers kept dogs. They were used for hunting, for guarding, and simply as companions. A dog at the end of the day is a specific kind of company, reliably cheerful, uncomplicated in its satisfaction at your return, offering a warmth and a presence that required nothing in response but to be acknowledged. The dogs of ancient Egypt, like dogs everywhere, would have settled near their owners in the evening with a sigh of deep contentment that is the same sigh dogs produce today. There would have been other animals too, not as pets but as sounds. The village was not isolated from the landscape of the Nile Valley. Frogs would have been present in the irrigation channels, their nighttime chorus beginning as the light faded, a sound that in some ways has been the background music of every human settlement near water since before human beings were fully human. There would have been crickets, and the occasional distant howl of a jackal from the desert edges, and the flap and cry of night birds. The soundscape of the night in ancient Egypt was not silence. It was a particular kind of sound, the sound of living things going about their nighttime business, the sound of water moving in the channels, the sound of the wind if there was wind, the sound of the village settling as people moved less and spoke less, and gradually, room by room and rooftop by rooftop, went still. This was not the silence that some people seek when they want quiet. It was a fuller thing, an ambient sound that the brain could hold without effort, that required no interpretation, that simply existed as a kind of auditory backdrop to the thoughts that were, themselves, becoming less sharp and less urgent. We have been talking for some time now, and it seems appropriate to acknowledge that you may be considerably closer to sleep than you were when we began. This is not a problem. This is, in fact, the purpose of this podcast. But we will continue anyway, because there is still more to say, and because the continuation of a calm voice saying calm things is itself a kind of company in the movement towards sleep. Let us talk about light. The light in Egyptian homes after dark came from oil lamps, typically small, shallow clay dishes filled with castor oil or animal fat, with a wick made of twisted linen floating in the oil. These lamps produced a warm, flickering yellowish light that was fundamentally different in quality from any modern artificial light. It was dim by contemporary standards, and it moved, the flame responding to the slight air currents of the room. In this light, shadows were deep and not entirely stable. The walls of the room seemed to pulse slightly as the lamp flame wavered, and objects in the room, the clay vessels, the wooden furniture, the tools hung on the wall, took on a quality that was warm and soft and slightly indistinct. This kind of light is, as anyone who has ever spent an evening by candlelight knows, inherently calming. There is something about low, warm, moving light that is profoundly compatible with relaxation and sleepiness. The harsh blue-tinted brightness of modern screens and electric bulbs is essentially a novelty in the history of human evening experience, and the body's confusion about it is well documented. For most of human history, including all of ancient Egyptian history, the light of evening was this: warm, dim, flickering, and gentle. The transition from daylight to this kind of lamplight was a signal the body recognized instantly. Night is here. It is time to rest. Lamp oil in ancient Egypt was a resource that required management. It was part of the rations distributed to workers, listed alongside the grain and the bear and the other staples. The amount allocated was sufficient for essential evening light, but not extravagant. A worker's household would not have lit the house brightly. They would have used lamps judiciously in the room where people were gathered, and then, as the evening progressed and people moved towards sleep, the lamps would have been extinguished one by one until the house was dark and the only light was the stars above the open roof and the faint luminescence of the desert sky. The transition from lamplight to starlight is a transition that very few modern people experience. In most cities and suburbs there is no true darkness, only a dimmer version of the ambient electric glow. In ancient Egypt, when the last lamp went out, the darkness was real. And yet it was not a frightening darkness, not for people whose eyes had adjusted and who could see the stars and knew the sound of their village. It was simply the dark, the ordinary dark of a world without electric light, in which the eyes found what light there was, and the brain relaxed its vigilance because the familiar sounds of home were still there. Let us spend a little time now with the concept of sleep itself, as understood by ancient Egyptians. Sleep was not simply a biological necessity in Egyptian thought. It was a state that had cosmological and spiritual significance. The moment of sleep was understood as a small enactment of the daily death and rebirth of the sun. When a person fell asleep, their consciousness, their soul or spirit, which the Egyptians understood as a complex entity with multiple components, became temporarily freer, less anchored to the physical body and the physical world. This was the state in which dreams occurred, and dreams were taken seriously. The Egyptians believed that dreams could be messages from the divine, could predict future events, could provide guidance in difficult situations. There were professional dream interpreters, and there were written dream books, collections of standard dream scenarios and their interpretations. To dream of a white horse meant one thing, to dream of a river in flood meant another. These interpretations were not universal or invariable. They depended on context and on the skill of the interpreter, but the fundamental premise that the dreaming mind was in contact with something beyond the ordinary waking world was taken as given. This meant that the moment of falling asleep was, in some sense, an important threshold. It was not simply the moment when consciousness faded. It was the moment when the deeper self became accessible, when the divine might make contact, when the soul became a little more its fuller self. This is a beautiful way to understand what happens each night, and it suggests that the ancient Egyptians might have had a somewhat less anxious relationship to sleep than many modern people do. Sleep was not time wasted, it was time differently spent, in a realm that had its own value and its own kind of significance. Of course, this is the idealized version. In practice, people fell asleep because they were tired and their bodies demanded it. But the framework in which that falling asleep occurred, the cosmological and spiritual context that made sleep meaningful, rather than merely necessary, is worth noting. It is a gentler way of understanding the end of the day. Let us now take a very slow and unhurried tour through the seasons of the Egyptian year and how they shaped the afterwork experience. We have 3 seasons to consider: Eket, Pere, and Shemu. Each had its own character, its own demands, and its own particular quality of evening. Eket was the flood season, which ran roughly from our July to November. When the Nile flooded, the agricultural land was covered with water, and the farming work of ploughing and planting could not be done. This was the season when large-scale building projects were most active, because the flooded land meant that stone could be transported on the river with relative ease, and because the farmers who worked the land for the rest of the year were available to work on other things. The Great Pyramids were mostly built during flood season, using the labour of workers who came not as slaves, as popular imagination once had it, but as state workers who were fed and housed and whose labour was considered a form of service to the divine order. During Eket, the evenings had a particular humidity and smell. The flooded land changed the air of the Nile Valley, filling it with the rich smell of wet earth and aquatic vegetation, a smell that was associated with fertility and abundance, and the guarantee that the crops of the coming season would be good. The sound of the flood was present too. The water was not violent, not a rushing torrent, but a steady, wide, quiet presence that covered the fields and reflected the sky. On evenings during Eket, the whole world seemed to be water and sky, with the thin strip of human habitation along the levees holding its own amid the 2 great expanses. Pere, the growing season, ran roughly from November to March. This was the time of planting and tending, when the fields emerged from the receding flood as dark, rich, almost impossibly fertile soil. Crops were planted: wheat, barley, flax, legumes of various kinds. The evenings during Pere were cooler, particularly in what we would call winter, and this was considered the most comfortable time of the Egyptian year. The air was clear, the nights were cool enough to make sleeping under a cover pleasant, and the days were not so intensely hot that the body arrived home exhausted by heat as much as by labour. Shemu, the harvest season, ran roughly from March to July, and it was the most physically demanding time of the agricultural year. The work of harvesting grain in the full heat of the Egyptian summer, bending and cutting and gathering and carrying, was intensive and exhausting. The evenings of Shemu had a different quality. The tiredness at the end of the day was deeper, more total, and the desire for rest was correspondingly stronger. Workers would have arrived home during Shemu more thoroughly depleted than at other times of year. But the harvest also meant abundance. The grain was in, the work was done, and the period of celebration and relative ease that followed the harvest was anticipated. The grain harvest was followed by threshing and winnowing, the separation of the grain from the chaff. Threshing was done by driving animals over the cut grain, their hooves breaking the heads and releasing the kernels. Winnowing was done by tossing the grain in the air and letting the wind carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back. These were communal activities, done in the open air, and they had a festive quality even though they were work. The harvest was the culmination of the agricultural year, and the completion of the winnowing was an occasion for celebration. We should say something more about the specific experience of heat in an Egyptian worker's life, because it is so central and because it so profoundly shapes the experience of rest. The heat of the Egyptian summer is not abstract. It is immediate, physical, and inescapable, even in the shade, even with water nearby, even with the north wind blowing. The heat of an Egyptian summer afternoon is a presence in itself, something that presses down on the body and slows the mind and makes the simple act of not being in direct sunlight feel like a relief. Workers in the tombs were actually slightly better off in this regard, since the underground rock remained relatively cool even in summer. But the walk to and from the valley was in the open air, and the midday hours were genuinely intense. The human body's response to heat is, physiologically, not so different from its response to the onset of sleep. The blood moves toward the surface of the skin, the heart rate slows slightly, the muscles relax in a search for coolness. In the most intense heat, the eyelids grow heavy even when the person has not been working particularly hard, simply as a response to the thermal load on the body. For an Egyptian worker arriving home at the end of a summer afternoon, the combination of physical exhaustion and the body's heat response would have made the desire to lie down in a cool and shaded place almost irresistible. The shade of a house, even a modest mud brick house with small windows, was a genuine refuge during the heat of the day. The thick mud brick walls absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, maintaining a temperature inside the house that was several degrees cooler than the outside air at the hottest part of the day. By evening, when the outside air had begun to cool, the walls would release the heat they had accumulated, which is why the roof, open to the night sky and the slight breeze, was often more comfortable for sleeping than the rooms below. Let us rest for a moment in a particular image. It is late evening in Deir el-Medina. Most of the houses are quiet. A few lamps are still burning behind small, high windows. On several rooftops, the low shapes of sleeping bodies are just visible against the dark sky. A cat moves along the top of a low wall, pausing occasionally to look at something invisible in the dark below. A dog shifts position somewhere nearby and sighs. The Nile, invisible from here but never truly absent from the sensory experience of anyone who lives in the Nile Valley, is present as a faint smell in the slight breeze. The stars are extraordinary. They are the same stars that are there every clear night, but they are never routine. Orion is visible, though the Egyptians knew it as something else. They associated the configuration of stars that we call Orion's belt with Osiris, the god of the dead and the afterlife, and the cycle of death and rebirth that was the central organizing metaphor of Egyptian religion. The star we call Sirius was to the Egyptians the star Sopdet, associated with the goddess Isis and with the beginning of the flood season, because the annual rising of Sirius on the eastern horizon just before sunrise in late summer coincided with the beginning of the Nile flood. These stars were not decorative. They were a calendar, a theology, and a comfort all at once. We have been talking about the village of Deir el-Medina because it is so well documented. But we should not leave the impression that all Egyptian workers lived in such specialized settlements. Most of the population of ancient Egypt were farmers living in villages along the Nile, in communities that were more dispersed and less intensively administered than Deir el-Medina. For these farmers, the after-work experience was shaped by the same basic conditions: the heat, the stars, the Nile, the mud brick houses, the oil lamps, the bread, the beer. But the specific texture of the evening would have been different. A farming village in the delta, in the flat green country where the Nile branched into its many distributaries before reaching the sea, would have had a different character from a village in the upper reaches of the Nile, where the valley was narrow and the desert cliffs were close on both sides. In the delta, the evenings were more humid, the air heavier, the sound of water more pervasive. The vegetation was denser, the birds more numerous, the night chorus of frogs and insects louder. In the upper valley, the evenings were drier, the air cleaner, the sky more definitively dark, the stars more brilliant, the cliffs a constant presence on both sides, glowing orange and then fading to a dim silver grey as the light left them. In both places, in all the places along the 4,000 kilometres of the Nile, from the delta to the first cataract, people came home when their work was done. They washed, they ate, they talked, or sat in quiet company. They listened to the sounds of the evening. They watched the stars come out, and they slept. There is something profoundly reassuring about this continuity. 3,000 years is a very long time in the terms of recorded human history. The civilization of ancient Egypt was fully mature when most of what we think of as Western civilization was still in its earlier stages. And yet the basic shape of the working person's day, and the basic shape of the rest that followed it, was the same then as it is now. The details differ enormously, but the structure is the same. Effort followed by rest, heat followed by cool, social obligation followed by private peace, wakefulness followed by sleep. We tend to think of ancient Egypt as remote and strange, and it was remote and strange in many ways. The theology, the monumental architecture, the elaborate rituals of death and burial, the complex bureaucratic state, the hieroglyphic writing system. These are genuinely different from anything in the contemporary world. But the people who built the monuments and staffed the bureaucracy and practiced the rituals were not strange. They were people. They had the same range of feelings, the same basic needs, the same pleasures and discomforts, the same desire at the end of a long day to put down the work and simply be. Let us talk for a moment about what ancient Egyptians might have drunk in the evening other than beer. Water was the most basic option, and it was not always safe by modern standards, which is actually one of the reasons beer was so common. The fermentation process killed pathogens, making beer safer to drink than untreated river water. But water was still consumed, especially after physical work, and it would have been kept in porous clay vessels that allowed slight evaporation through the walls, cooling the water slightly in the process. This slight coolness was not dramatic, but it was real, and the sensation of slightly cool water on a hot and dry throat after hours of labour was one of the small, real pleasures of the Egyptian workday's end. Wine was known to the ancient Egyptians. Vineyards existed in the delta and in oases, and wine was produced and consumed. But wine was a more expensive commodity than beer, and was associated more with the wealthy and with special occasions. Workers might have had access to wine at festivals, or when it was provided as part of a celebration or offering. The daily drink of the worker was beer, consistently and reliably. The wine of ancient Egypt was not the wine of modern imagination. It was often made with other fruits as well as grapes, and it was sometimes spiced or mixed with other substances. There were other drinks as well, herbal infusions and preparations that occupied a middle ground between food and medicine. Fenugreek was used, and carob and various other plants that grew along the Nile or were traded in from regions to the south and east. Some of these had mild sedative or relaxing properties. Whether Egyptian workers regularly consumed them as a deliberate aid to sleep or relaxation we cannot say, but the knowledge of plant properties was well developed in ancient Egypt, and it seems likely that people who felt the need for something to help them rest had access to some preparations that served that purpose. We are now going to spend some time talking about a specific aspect of the Egyptian experience of rest that is often overlooked: the midday rest. This is relevant to the evening because it shaped the distribution of tiredness through the day. In the intense heat of an Egyptian summer, it was not practical to work through the middle of the day. The records from Deir el-Medina suggest that workers rose very early, often before dawn, and worked through the morning. They then had a rest period in the middle of the day, during the worst of the heat, before working again in the late afternoon and early evening as the heat diminished. This is essentially the model of the siesta, which persists in many hot climate cultures to this day, and which represents a sensible adaptation to the thermal realities of life in regions with very hot summers. The midday rest was not simply a luxury. It was a practical response to conditions in which continued work in the full heat of the day would have been both inefficient and potentially dangerous. Workers who rested at midday arrived at the end of the full work day, in a somewhat different state than workers who had been going continuously since early morning. The tiredness of the evening was real but not completely depleting. The midday rest, wherever it was taken, whether in the worker's own home or in a temporary shelter near the work site, would have had its own quality. It was a different kind of rest from the nighttime sleep, shorter, lighter, more easily interrupted, taken in the heat of the day rather than the cool of the night. Some people can sleep easily in the middle of the day, others only doze, or lie awake with closed eyes, or simply sit in the shade and let the mind wander. In any of these forms, the midday rest was a recognized part of the Egyptian workday, a built-in pause that acknowledged the limits of the human body and the demands of the climate. We should also, before we move further toward the end of this story, spend some time with the formal and structured aspects of Egyptian leisure. Not all leisure in ancient Egypt was informal and domestic. There were organized public entertainments and celebrations that were a significant part of social life. Festivals have already been mentioned, and they were central. But there were also events that were not specifically religious in character, or at least not primarily so. Wrestling was a popular entertainment in ancient Egypt, and we have many representations of wrestling matches in tomb paintings. Swimmers are depicted as well, enjoying the Nile in ways that went beyond the practical. Board games were common. The game of senet, which was played on a board of 30 squares, and whose rules are not entirely understood by modern scholars, but which appears to have involved elements of both chance and strategy, was extremely popular, and examples of senet boards have been found in many archaeological contexts, from simple painted boards on flat pieces of wood to elaborately decorated versions in precious materials found in royal tombs. The presence of senet boards in royal tombs tells us something about how the Egyptians thought about leisure. The game was considered valuable enough to accompany the dead into the afterlife, which suggests that it was not merely entertainment, but something with a deeper significance. Some scholars have interpreted senet as a symbolic journey through the underworld, its squares representing stages of the journey from death to rebirth. Whether this interpretation is correct, we cannot know for certain, but it is consistent with the way ancient Egyptians tended to invest even ordinary activities with cosmological meaning. Whether senet was played in the evenings in workers' homes is almost certain. The game was widely known and widely played. An ostrakon from Deir el-Medina even records a game played by two of the workers. It would have been a natural way to pass the time in the evening before sleep, sitting across from a family member or a neighbour, moving the pieces across the board by the light of a small oil lamp. The outcome determined partly by strategy and partly by the throw of small sticks or bones that served as randomizing elements. The social dimension of the evening is worth emphasizing. Ancient Egyptian life was lived in community in a way that modern life often is not. The physical layout of a village like Deir el-Medina, with its closely spaced houses and its central street and its communal spaces, meant that private life was always in some proximity to communal life. Neighbours knew each other's business. The walls of houses were not soundproof. The evening activities of one household were not entirely invisible or inaudible to the next. This is not a complaint. For most of human history, this kind of close communal living has been the norm, and it has its own comforts. The sounds of your neighbour's household are evidence that the community exists, that you're not alone, that the rhythms of other lives are proceeding normally. The smell of food being cooked nearby is not intrusive. It is company of a kind. The sound of a child being put to bed, the murmur of adults in conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from somewhere close. These are the sounds of a functioning human community, and they are, for most people, the background sounds of safety and belonging. We are approaching the latter part of this story, and the hour is becoming very late. Let us spend some time now with the texture of sleep itself, or rather the texture of the falling asleep process, which is where we find ourselves at the moment most likely. The ancient Egyptians did not have a sophisticated scientific understanding of what happens in the brain during sleep, but they had observations, and they had a framework for understanding those observations that, while different from the modern scientific framework, served its purpose. The heaviness of the limbs that comes with tiredness was understood as a withdrawal of the active, animating principle from the extremities toward the centre of the body. The slowing of thought was understood as the mind becoming quieter, the interior landscape of consciousness settling like silt in water that has been stirred and is now growing still. The approach of dreams was understood as the softening of the boundary between the waking world and the other world, the world of the dead and the divine, which was always there but usually inaccessible. These are metaphors, of course, rather than physiological descriptions. But they are not bad metaphors. The experience of falling asleep is genuinely like a settling, a quieting, a softening of boundaries. The body becomes less distinct, less precisely located in space. The thoughts become less coherent, less insistent, less attached to the specific concerns of the day. The self becomes larger and less defined, or perhaps smaller and less defended, depending on how you look at it. Something releases, something that has been held throughout the day, some degree of alertness and readiness slowly lets go. In a mud brick house in ancient Egypt, on a roof under the stars, this process would have been accompanied by sounds that are among the most reliably sleep-inducing that exist. The very slight sound of the wind, the distant water, the frogs, the occasional cry of a night bird, the physical sensation of the reed mat, the weight of the linen sheet, the warmth of the air, which was never as cold as sleep requires in modern bedrooms, because the efficient cooling of the sleeping body was provided not by cold air, but by the slight evaporation of sweat in the dry desert night. And then, gradually, imperceptibly, the boundary between waking and sleeping dissolved. The craftsman on his roof, the farmer in his village, the scribe in his city house, all of them crossed the threshold in their own time, without fanfare, without ceremony, without even quite knowing when it happened. One moment they were there, aware of the stars and the sounds and the weight of their own tiredness, and then, by degrees too fine to measure, they were not there in that way anymore. They were somewhere else, or nowhere at all, or both at once in the way of sleep. It is worth noting before we move on that the sleep of ancient Egyptians was not medically better or worse than modern sleep, not categorically. They had their sleepless nights, their anxious wakings, their dreams that disturbed rather than comforted. They had the interruptions of children and animals and neighbours, and the various discomforts of physical life without modern medicine. They had in some ways harder lives that produced a deeper tiredness that made sleep easier. But they also had the particular kind of restlessness that comes from a mind full of things that cannot be resolved, and this is not a feature only of modern life. What they did have, perhaps, was a simpler relationship to the end of the day. When the light was gone, work was genuinely over. There was no artificial extension of the day by electric light, no device that kept the mind active when the body wanted to rest, no global information system pouring news and images and urgencies into the consciousness at all hours. The darkness was a real boundary, and the body recognized it as such. When the lamps went out, the signal was clear. This is night, this is rest, this is the time for the other thing. Let us end in the manner of a properly unhurried historical meditation, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a simple image. Somewhere along the Nile, in any of the thousands of years that we call ancient Egyptian civilization, on an evening like the one we have been imagining throughout this podcast, a person finished their work and went home. They washed their hands and face. They ate something simple and filling. They sat for a while in the company of people they knew well, or perhaps in comfortable solitude. The lamps burned low, the night deepened, the stars appeared one by one and then all together in their full and extraordinary abundance, and then they slept. They slept as we sleep, with the same basic architecture of sleep, the same cycles of depth and lightness, the same dreaming, the same morning return to wakefulness. They slept in a world that was in many ways utterly different from our own, and in ways that were entirely the same. They were tired. The day was done. The night was there. They let go. This is, when you think about it, a very old and very reliable pattern. It has been working for as long as there have been people. It will work tonight as it has worked every night, with a constancy that is more reliable than almost anything else in the history of the world. The day ends, the dark comes, the body knows what to do. You are listening to the History Podcast for Sleep, and this has been our episode on how ancient Egyptians relaxed after work. We hope you are very comfortable. We hope the day's concerns have grown a little distant and a little quiet. We hope that the image of that roof and those stars and that particular quality of stillness that comes at the end of a day well and fully lived has been useful to you in finding your own way toward rest. Good night. We should perhaps, before we truly conclude, talk a little more about the role that scent played in the Egyptian evening experience, because scent is one of the most powerful and most neglected of the senses when it comes to understanding the past. We have detailed visual records of ancient Egypt, the paintings in tombs, the statues, the reliefs carved in stone, the objects preserved in desert conditions. We have textual records, we have physical objects, but we have no direct access to the smells of the ancient world, and yet smell is the sense most directly connected to memory and emotion, the sense most capable of transporting us instantly and involuntarily to another time and place. The Egypt of the ancient world smelled particular. It smelled of the Nile, as we have mentioned, that characteristic combination of water and silt and aquatic vegetation that defined the sensory landscape of the valley. It smelled of the desert, which has its own smell, dry, mineral, faintly animal, the smell of sun on stone and of dust that contains the ground-up residue of centuries. It smelled of the specific plants and animals that made up daily life, garlic and onions cooking, which were staple ingredients of Egyptian food. The animals kept near homes, donkeys and goats and ducks. The particular smell of dried flax and linen, which was the dominant textile of Egyptian life. The incense burned in temples and sometimes in homes, Kaifi being the most famous Egyptian incense, a complex preparation made from multiple aromatic substances including myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and other materials. Kifi deserves particular attention because it connects the domestic and the divine in a way that is characteristic of Egyptian sensibility. Kaifi was used in temples as an offering, but it was also used in homes as an evening incense, burned specifically at the end of the day as a kind of olfactory signal of transition from the active day to the restful night. Ancient sources describe it as having calming properties, as helping to induce sleep, as being specifically appropriate for the evening hours. Whether the calming properties were chemical, which some of the ingredients may indeed have had, or whether they were the result of the Pavlovian association between the scent and the habitual relaxation of the evening, is impossible to say. Probably both. The burning of kifi in an Egyptian home in the evening would have released a complex, warm, slightly sweet, slightly resinous smell that mixed with the other smells of the evening. The food, the lamp oil, the bodies of people and animals, the night air coming in through the high windows. This combination of smells would have been as specific and as recognizable as any other aspect of the Egyptian evening experience. It would have been the smell of home, of the end of the day, of the approach of rest. We should also spend some time with the physical experience of the Egyptian body at rest. The bodies of ancient Egyptians were, as we have mentioned, marked by their labour, but they were also bodies that had adapted to their environment over generations, that were physically capable of the work they performed, and that, when that work was done, were capable of a profound and genuine rest that owed something to the sheer completeness of their physical expenditure during the day. This is something that modern people who live largely sedentary lives sometimes miss. The particular quality of tiredness that comes from sustained physical work, which is not the frazzled, stimulated tiredness of mental and digital overload, but a clean, whole-body tiredness that moves naturally and efficiently towards sleep. The Egyptian worker who lay down on his roof mat had used his body during the day in ways that addressed the full range of its physical capacities. He had walked, carried, lifted, bent, reached, balanced, and exerted himself in a dozen other specific ways. His muscles were genuinely tired, his joints genuinely used, his cardiovascular system genuinely exercised. This is the condition in which sleep comes most easily and most deeply, the condition in which the transition from wakefulness to sleep is not a project requiring effort and strategy, but simply what happens when you lie down and close your eyes. The linen that Egyptians slept under and on was a specific material with specific properties. Linen, made from flax, is a naturally cooling fabric. It absorbs moisture, allows air to circulate, and does not trap heat in the way that wool does. In a hot climate, linen is an exceptionally practical textile. The quality of Egyptian linen varied enormously, from the very fine, almost transparent fabric used by the wealthy and for temple offerings, to the coarser, more everyday linen used in ordinary households. But even ordinary household linen had the basic properties of the material: light, breathable, cool, pleasant against the skin. The reed mats that served as sleeping surfaces in Egyptian homes were also specific objects with specific properties. Reed is a natural insulator. It lifts the body slightly off the floor, allowing some air circulation beneath, and provides a surface that is firm without being hard in the way that bare earth or stone would be. The weave of the mat created a slight texture that was neither soft nor rough, but had the reassuring substance of a material that had been made by hand for a specific purpose. These mats were often beautifully made. The craft of basket and mat weaving was well developed in ancient Egypt, and even utilitarian objects were given a care and skill in their construction that reflected the Egyptian tendency to take the material world seriously. Let us also say something about the particular silence of the ancient world at night that we have mentioned but not fully dwelt upon. The absence of industrial, mechanical, and electronic noise from the ancient sound environment was total. There were no motors, no air conditioners, no refrigerators, no traffic, no aircraft, no electronic devices of any kind. The sounds of the night in ancient Egypt were entirely biological and meteorological, the sounds of living things and of weather. This is not silence in the sense of an absence of sound. It is a very different category of sound environment from the modern one. The human auditory system evolved in this kind of sound environment, where the sounds of night were the sounds of living things going about their nighttime business, and where any sound that was not biological or meteorological in character was worth paying attention to because it was anomalous. This is one of the reasons why certain natural sounds are so reliably calming. The rain, the wind, the water, the birds, the frogs. They are the sounds that the brain recognizes as normal and safe. The sounds that signal that nothing unusual is happening, that the world is proceeding as it should, that there is no need to be alert. In the absence of artificial light and artificial sound, the ancient night was a different kind of experience from the modern night. It was more complete, more encompassing, more genuinely other than the day. The transition from day to night in the ancient world was not softened by the continuation of daylight conditions indoors. It was real and total. When the sun set, the world changed fundamentally, and the body registered this change and responded to it. We have talked a great deal about the working men of ancient Egypt, the craftsmen and farmers who made up the majority of the population, but we should also, in the interest of completeness, say something about the women of ancient Egypt and their after-work experience, because Egyptian women worked, and their work was both similar to and different from the work of men. Egyptian women participated in many aspects of agricultural and craft production. They worked in the fields during planting and harvest. They were weavers and spinners. They were bakers and brewers. They managed households, which was genuinely demanding work in a world without modern conveniences. They were midwives and healers. They were musicians and dancers. In some periods and in some positions, they were scribes and administrators. The ideal of the Egyptian woman presented in formal art was one of dignity and capability, not passivity. After a day's work, a woman in ancient Egypt would have had a similar experience of tiredness and the desire for rest as a man, with the specific character of her tiredness reflecting the specific character of her work. The weaver who had spent the day at a loom, making the repeated gestures of the shuttle and the beater, would have had tired arms and a certain kind of eye strain from the concentration required. The baker who had been grinding grain in the early morning and then tending the fire and shaping and baking loaves would have had a different kind of tiredness, more heat-related, more physically total. The woman who had been managing children and the household through the heat of the day would have had the specific exhaustion of constant responsiveness, of never being fully allowed to let attention relax. For women with children, the end of the workday did not mean the end of all demands. Children needed to be fed, put to bed, soothed if they were upset, managed if they were energetic in the way that children remain energetic long after adults have run out of energy. This is a kind of tiredness that is very specifically human, and that has nothing whatsoever to do with civilization or historical period. The experience of a mother in ancient Egypt trying to get a small child to sleep while being herself exhausted is so completely familiar across all of human experience that it requires no elaboration, but children do sleep eventually, and then the evening belonged more fully to the adults. In a house where children had finally gone quiet, The quality of the silence was different from the silence of a house without children. It was a silence achieved against some resistance, a silence that had been earned, and it had a particular sweetness. We should, in the spirit of completeness that has guided this entire podcast, also spend a moment with the experience of elderly people in ancient Egypt at the end of a workday. Old age in ancient Egypt was real but relatively rare by modern standards. A person who reached old age had survived the many hazards of Egyptian life. The diseases, the physical injuries, the childbirth risks for women, the occupational hazards for workers. Old age was respected in Egyptian society. The wisdom of the elderly was theoretically valued, and there are many texts that frame the relationship between the young and old in terms of deference to experience. The evening for an elderly person would have had a different texture from the evening for a younger worker. The tiredness would have accumulated differently. The relief of rest would have come with a different urgency. The body's insistence on stopping would have been more immediate and less negotiable. The stars seen from the roof of a house in old age, after a lifetime of seeing them, would have had a depth of familiarity that is its own form of comfort. These stars have been here every clear night of my life. They were here before I was born. They will be here after I am gone. There is something genuinely settling about that thought. Egyptian religious and funerary texts suggest that the prospect of death was not uniformly terrifying to ancient Egyptians. The elaborate preparation for death, the careful maintenance of the tomb, the provision of objects and texts to help the deceased navigate the afterlife, suggest a serious and sustained engagement with death as a real transition to a real other state rather than simply an ending. The afterlife was imagined in the pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead as a continuation of the best aspects of earthly life: fields, boats, food, family, the company of the gods. The prospect of that continuation, for someone who had lived well and worked hard and fulfilled their obligations, was not simply frightening. And so even for the elderly worker, lying on the roof on what might or might not be one of his or her last evenings, there was a framework for understanding what was happening that was less bleak than the purely secular view. The sun sets every evening and rises every morning. This is what the sun does. The person sets and the person rises. This is what people do. It is the same motion, repeated at every scale, from the daily motion of the heavenly bodies to the seasonal motion of the agricultural year to the generational motion of birth and death. And the children who continue what the parents began. This is, of course, a comforting story rather than a factual description of what happens at death. But comforting stories are not nothing. They are part of how human beings live with the conditions of their existence, and the ancient Egyptians had developed one of the most elaborate and in some ways one of the most beautiful of all the comforting stories that human cultures have produced. That they told this story to themselves in their daily lives, not only in temples and tombs, but in the ordinary rhythms of the day, is part of what made it effective. We are now very far into this podcast, and the hour is likely very late for you, and we are grateful that you have stayed with us. Or more likely, we are grateful that you fell asleep some time ago, and are simply receiving the sound of this voice as a kind of sonic company while you sleep. Either way, you're in good company. You're in the company of every person who has ever lain down at the end of a long day, under whatever sky was available to them, in whatever home they had, with whatever kind of tiredness their particular life had given them, and let the day go. There is a specific moment in the process of falling asleep that is very difficult to describe because, by definition, the person experiencing it is not quite fully conscious and therefore cannot fully observe it. It is the moment when the thoughts stop being thoughts about something and become just thoughts, when the narrative that the mind has been constructing all day, the story of what happened and what will happen and what should happen and what was said and what might be said, begins to lose its coherence and its urgency and becomes simply the movement of the mind with no particular destination. This is not quite the same as dreaming, which is its own kind of narrative. This is before dreaming, in the space between waking and dreaming, where the categories of ordinary experience have begun to dissolve. Ancient Egyptians had a word for the soul or spirit that was active during sleep and dreaming. The bay, often depicted as a human-headed bird, was the aspect of the person that could travel freely between the world of the living and the world of the dead, that could leave the body during sleep and return to it at waking. The bear was not the whole person. It was one of several distinct spiritual components that together made up the complete human being. But it was the mobile and travelling part, the part that was not anchored to the physical body in the way that the car, the life force, was anchored. The image of the bay as a bird is beautiful and apt. A bird can go where a body cannot. It can rise from where the body lies and travel through the air without difficulty. It can see from above, can navigate by landmarks that are invisible from ground level, can cross distances that would take the body days or weeks in moments, and it can return as birds return to their nests at the end of the day, folding its wings and settling back into the place where it began. This is what sleep was in the Egyptian understanding, a flight of the travelling self and a return. We are almost at the end of our time together tonight. Before we conclude completely, let us take one more slow walk through the village in the deep of the night after all the lamps have been extinguished and all the voices have fallen silent and all the bodies have found their resting places. The village is dark. The mud brick walls absorb the starlight rather than reflecting it, so the shapes of the houses are visible as slightly darker shapes against the lighter sky, their flat rooftops against the stars. A cat moves between two houses with the absolute silence that cats have always been capable of. The air has cooled considerably since the hottest part of the day. The north wind, that reliable gift of Egyptian evenings, moves gently through the village, carrying with it the smell of the Nile and of the desert and of all the complex life that exists between them. It moves over the sleeping bodies on the roofs, cooling the skin that is uncovered, lifting a corner of a linen sheet, passing on. In one house, a baby makes a small sound, and then is quiet again. In another house, someone turns over in their sleep with the unconscious efficiency of a body that knows how to adjust itself without waking the mind. A dog, somewhere at the edge of the village, raises its head at some sound from the desert, listens for a moment, and puts its head back down. There is nothing to worry about. There is nothing to do. The stars move. They always move, slowly, in the great wheel of the night sky, turning around the northern pole in a motion so steady and so reliable that it has been used for navigation and for timekeeping since before writing existed. In a few hours the eastern horizon will begin to lighten, so slightly at first that only the animals will notice, the birds beginning their first tentative morning sounds while the sky is still entirely dark to human eyes, and then gradually the light will grow and the sky will shift from black to deep blue to lighter blue, and the stars will fade one by one until only the brightest remain, and then those too will fade and the sun will rise and the day will begin again. But that is hours away. For now the village is asleep, and the night is long, and there is no need to think about the morning. There is only this, the particular piece of a community at rest, the stars overhead, the slight wind, the distant sound of the Nile doing what it has always done. This is how ancient Egyptians relaxed after work. Not so differently from how anyone has ever relaxed after work. They stopped, and they rested, and they slept. We hope you are resting too. We hope that the day's concerns have become very small and very distant, that the weight of the body is very comfortable, that the darkness behind your closed eyes is very deep and very easy. The stories that needed to be told today have been told. The work that needed to be done today has been done. The sun has set or is setting, and the stars are there as they have always been, as they will always be. Sleep well. This has been the History Podcast for Sleep. We will be here again whenever you need us. Good night. Good night. Good night. Before the silence takes hold completely, let us linger a little longer. There is no hurry. There is nothing after this. There is only the continuing sound of this voice, which we hope has become by now as unremarkable as the sound of the north wind or the frogs in the reeds, something the brain accepts as background and does not strain to follow. We will talk for a little longer about the ordinary things, the things that were always true and are always true, the things that make the gap between the ancient and the modern smaller than it usually seems. Consider the experience of drinking water at night. It is such a small thing. In the middle of the night, or in the transition to sleep, the slight dryness of the throat that comes from breathing through the mouth, the instinctive reach for something to drink, the cool of the cup or the vessel, the few swallows that are exactly the right amount. This is identical now to what it was in ancient Egypt. The mechanics of drinking water, the relief it provides, the way it settles the body slightly more deeply into rest, these have not changed at all. The craftsman on his roof, the farmer in his house, the scribe in the city. If they woke in the night with a dry throat, they drank water from the clay vessel that was kept nearby, and they felt the same small relief that you might feel in the same circumstances. The water was different water, in a different vessel, in a different time and place, but the body's experience of it was the same. This is worth knowing. The continuity of small physical experiences across enormous spans of time is a quiet form of kinship with people who would otherwise seem entirely remote. Let us think about the specific quality of what we might call the Egyptian bed, for lack of a better word. The Egyptians did have beds, in the sense of raised platforms for sleeping. We have examples from many periods, wooden frames with woven mesh or leather supports, sometimes with carved legs, sometimes with a slight slope so that the head was elevated above the feet. This was a practical feature, because the slight elevation of the head was thought to have health benefits, and also because it allowed for a footboard at the lower end that kept the sleeper from sliding down. The finest Egyptian beds were objects of considerable craftsmanship and beauty. Tutankhamun's tomb contained several beds, including one made of gilded wood with carved leonine legs. That is clearly a luxury object of the highest order. But even ordinary beds in ordinary houses were real pieces of furniture made with care and maintained as valuable possessions. They were not thrown together, not treated as unimportant. The place where a person spent a third of their life was worth making well. Whether our craftsmen at Deir el-Medina slept on a formal bed, or on a mat on the floor, or on a mat on the roof, would have depended on the season, the household's possessions, and the particular preferences of the family. The evidence from Deir el-Medina suggests that the houses there had raised platforms in their main rooms that served as seating during the day and sleeping surfaces at night. A versatile piece of fixed furniture that made efficient use of limited space. A mat placed on such a platform with a linen sheet would have been a perfectly adequate sleeping surface by the standards of the ancient world, and by the standards of most of the world's population for most of recorded history. The headrest deserves its own mention because it is one of the more distinctive and culturally specific objects in the Egyptian sleeping experience. Egyptians did not use pillows in the modern sense. Instead, they used headrests, curved objects, often made of wood or stone that supported the neck rather than the head, holding the head elevated above the sleeping surface. This sounds uncomfortable to modern ears, but it was the norm for Egyptian sleepers for thousands of years, which suggests that the body can adapt to a sleeping position that differs from what we consider standard. Headrests were personal objects and were sometimes buried with their owners, which tells us that they were considered significant enough to be carried into the afterlife. Some headrests were inscribed with protective spells or with the names of deities associated with sleep and dreams. The sleeping self needed protection, as the dreaming bard travelled through dangerous territory, and the headrest was one of the objects that could provide that protection. The protective aspect of the Egyptian sleeping experience is worth dwelling on. The night, in ancient Egyptian understanding, was not only a time of rest and dreaming, it was also a time of potential danger. The sun, as it travelled through the underworld during the night, faced obstacles and enemies, serpents and demons and forces of chaos that had to be defeated for the sun to be reborn each morning. Human sleepers, by analogy, face their own version of this journey. Dreams could be dangerous as well as instructive. The boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, which sleep softened, also opened channels that not everything benign could use. This is why texts and spells relating to sleep and dreaming were inscribed on objects, written on papyrus kept near the sleeping place, or recited before sleep. These were not expressions of terror. They were precautions, the same kind of precautions that a careful person takes at the end of the day, checking that the door is secured, that the fire is properly banked, that the children are safely in their places. The world was not without its dangers, and the preparations for sleep included acknowledgement of and provision against those dangers. There is something endearing about this, viewed from a distance. the elaborate theological and magical preparation for an act as ordinary as going to sleep reflects the Egyptian tendency to take the world seriously at every scale, to find significance and meaning in the ordinary, to believe that the small actions of daily life were connected to the great actions of the cosmos. Whether you believe, as the Egyptians did, that reciting a spell before sleep provided genuine protection for the travelling soul, or whether you believe, as most modern people would, that it was an act of psychological preparation with no supernatural dimension, the effect on the person going to sleep was probably similar. A sense of having done what could be done, of being as ready as possible for whatever the night held. The Egyptian disposition toward the world, which modern scholars sometimes describe as a kind of cosmic optimism grounded in the predictable regularity of the Nile and the sun, is reflected in the experience of daily life, including the experience of rest. The sun rose every morning. This was not taken for granted. It was understood as an achievement, a victory won each night in the underworld. But it was a victory that had been won every single day since the creation of the world, without exception. The sun had never failed to rise. This was the most reliable fact available to any human being anywhere in Egypt for the entirety of Egyptian civilization, every morning without fail. The Nile flooded every year. This too was not taken for granted. The flood was anxiously awaited and joyfully celebrated when it arrived. But it had arrived every year, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium. The agricultural calendar, the religious calendar, the entire structure of Egyptian civilization was built on the premise that these fundamental regularities would continue, and they did continue for 3,000 years. This is an almost incomprehensible span of cultural continuity. For the Egyptian worker lying on his roof, this continuity was not an abstraction. It was the texture of his world. The sun would rise tomorrow. The Nile would flood in its season. The stars would continue their reliable rotation. His work would continue, and his rest would continue, and the village would continue, and the tombs being cut in the valley would eventually be sealed, and the great people they were made for would travel to the west, and the world would go on. This was not a frightening thought. It was a comforting one. The world was proceeding as it had always proceeded, and his small part in it, his day of work and his evening of rest, was a legitimate contribution to that proceeding. There is a particular quality to the thought that you are part of something very old and very large and very reliable. It is the opposite of the feeling of being alone and adrift in a meaningless universe. The ancient Egyptians had developed, over 3,000 years, one of the most sophisticated and comprehensive frameworks for feeling part of something very old and very large and very reliable that any human culture has ever produced. That framework included their theology and their cosmology and their architecture and their art. But it also included the simple daily rhythms, the work, the rest, the food, the water, the sleep. You are in your own way part of something very old and very large and very reliable. The act of sleeping, which you're engaged in now or approaching rapidly, is one of the oldest acts available to any member of the species you belong to. Every one of your ancestors, in an unbroken line stretching back to before there were words for anything, fell asleep at the end of their day. Some of them were in danger when they slept. Some of them were in comfort. All of them were tired, and all of them closed their eyes, and all of them crossed the threshold that you are crossing now. This is the most ancient and the most universal of human experiences. The end of the day, the letting go of wakefulness, the surrender to sleep. It is older than any civilization. It is older than any language. It is part of what it means to have a body, to be a living thing in a world that has a sun and a night. The ancient Egyptians knew it and gave it beautiful names and built elaborate frameworks for understanding it, and you know it too in the same body that has known it for as long as there have been bodies. The last thought, as the craftsman finally crosses fully into sleep, the last thought before the bay lifts from its resting place and begins its nightly journey, is not a thought with words. It is more like a sensation, the feeling of being exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, at exactly the right time. The work is done. The night is here. The body knows what to do. Let it do it. This has been the History Podcast for Sleep. Thank you for listening. Thank you for resting. The ancient Egyptians would understand completely. Good night. We will add one more section, because there is always more to say, and because the night is long, and because the sound of a calm voice saying calm things is never wasted when the purpose is rest. This final section is a slow and very detailed account of the making of bread in an ancient Egyptian household at the end of the day, because bread making is one of the most hypnotic of all the domestic processes, and because the specific sounds and sensations of it are as good as any sound bath for the induction of sleep. In ancient Egypt, bread was not bought. It was made every day or every few days in the household or in communal baking facilities. The process began with grain, wheat or barley, stored in clay pots or in purpose-built grain silos that were a feature of many Egyptian households. The grain was measured out in ceramic cups, the right amount for the household's needs. Then it was ground. Grinding grain is one of the oldest and most rhythmic of all human activities. The quern, the grinding stone, was a standard piece of household equipment in ancient Egypt, found in homes at every economic level. It consisted of a lower stone, relatively flat, and an upper stone, held in both hands and moved back and forth over the grain that had been placed on the lower stone. The motion was steady and repetitive, forward, back, with a slight pressure that forced the grain between the two surfaces and broke it down first into coarse meal, and then, with continued grinding, into finer flour. The sound of the quern was a constant morning sound in ancient Egyptian households, as women ground the grain that would become the day's bread. But grain could also be ground in the evening in preparation for the next day's baking, and the sound of it in the evening had a different quality. Slower, perhaps, done by someone who was already tired, the rhythm slightly less crisp, the movement more languorous but still steady. The grain gave way to the stone with a soft, continuous sound that was part hiss and part scrape, regular and unremarkable and somehow deeply compatible with the approach of sleep. After grinding, the flour was mixed with water to make a dough. Egyptian bread dough was different from modern bread dough. It was often sourer, because the leavening came from wild yeasts and from the residue of previous batches left in the mixing vessel, a process called sourdough fermentation in modern terms, which was how all bread was leavened before commercial yeast existed. The dough would be mixed by hand, the fingers working through the wet flour and water, feeling for the right consistency, which was neither too dry nor too sticky, which had a certain elasticity that told experienced hands it was ready. The mixing of dough by hand is a remarkably soothing activity to observe and in the right mood to perform. The hands do repetitive work that requires attention but not intense concentration. The material under the hands changes slowly and in ways that are pleasant to the touch. The smell of the dough, yeasty and faintly sour, is one of the oldest domesticated smells in human experience. The smell of a process that has been producing food for 10,000 years. There is something ancestral in the smell of bread dough, something that the body recognizes below the level of conscious thought. The dough, once mixed, was set aside to rise. This was the slow part, the part that required only waiting. In a warm Egyptian household, the wild yeast would work steadily through the dough, producing the bubbles that would make the bread slightly lighter, giving it a texture and a flavour that distinguished it from simple unleavened flatbread. This rising took time, an hour or several hours, depending on the temperature and the liveliness of the yeast culture. It was the kind of waiting that required no active attention, only patience. The dough would rise without assistance. There was nothing to do but let it. While the dough rose, the household continued its evening. The lamp burned. The conversations wound down. The children, if there were children, were moved towards sleep. The adults sat or lay in the cooling air. Somewhere in the background the dough was doing its quiet, patient work, the yeast consuming the sugars in the flour and releasing the carbon dioxide that made the dough expand and grow fragrant. This is one of the very few entirely passive domestic processes. The dough makes itself given the right conditions. The baker is only the facilitator. Baking was typically done in the morning, in clay ovens that had been preheated with a fire of acacia wood or palm frond ribs. But we can imagine, for the purposes of this evening's meditation, a household where the bread is baked in the early evening, while there is still some daylight and while the oven has been heated from the midday meal. The clay oven, heated to the right temperature, received the shaped loaves, and the smell of baking bread filled the house and drifted through the windows and out into the village. The smell of baking bread is, across all cultures and all historical periods, one of the most universally recognized and almost universally pleasant smells that human civilization has produced. It is a smell that is simultaneously the smell of food and the smell of home, of warmth and provision and safety. In an ancient Egyptian village, the smell of bread baking in the evening was a signal. Someone is fed, someone is cared for, the household is functioning, the world is as it should be. It was, in its own olfactory way, as reassuring as the sound of the wind or the sight of the stars. The bread, when it came out of the oven, was dense and fragrant, its crust slightly hard from the heat of the clay, its interior soft and still warm. If it was eaten in the evening, it was eaten simply, perhaps with a bit of oil, perhaps with a paste of mashed garlic, perhaps with nothing at all. The act of eating warm bread at the end of the day, in the company of people you know, in a house you know, is one of those acts so old and so basic that it connects you directly and without effort to every human being who has ever done the same thing, in whatever time and whatever place. This is the gift of the ordinary. The extraordinary things that ancient Egyptians did, the pyramids and the mummies and the hieroglyphics and the complicated theology, are interesting and impressive and worth studying. But they are not the things that connect us most directly to those long-dead people. The thing that connects us most directly is the bread and the water and the tiredness and the stars and the desire to lie down and close the eyes and let the day go. Let us end one more time in the dark. The village is asleep. The bread is baked and the oven is cooling, and the smell of it lingers in the night air, mixing with the smell of the Nile and the desert and the particular complex smell of human habitation, which is the smell of fire and food and animals and bodies and the thousand small processes of daily life. The stars are brilliant. The north wind moves. The frogs continue their ancient chorus from the irrigation channels. In every house, in every room, in every sleeping body, the same process is underway. The slow, reliable, ancient process of sleep. The breath deepens. The muscles release the last of their held tension. The eyes, beneath their lids, are still. The mind, which has been working all day at the tasks and negotiations and perceptions and memories that constitute a human life, is finally, gradually, mercifully quiet. Tomorrow there will be work. Tomorrow the sun will rise and the day will make its demands. But tonight there is only this, the dark, the stars, the breath, the deep and total rest that is the body's great reward for the day's efforts. Ancient Egyptians knew this rest. They counted on it, prepared for it, gave it meaning and protection, and they woke from it each morning as the sun woke from its own journey through the dark, renewed and ready for what the day would ask. You are in good company tonight. You are in the company of everyone who has ever rested. The world is very old and has seen a great deal of sleep, and none of it was wasted, and none of it failed to lead to morning. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Breathe the way the body knows how to breathe when it's not being asked to do anything else. Let the thoughts drift and dissolve like clouds in a clear sky. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. The ancient Egyptians 3,000 years ago were exactly where they were supposed to be too, and they slept, and in the morning they got up and went back to work, cutting stone and grinding grain, and writing in beautiful pictures and making bread and brewing beer and watching the Nile and counting the stars. And then at the end of another day they came home again, and they rested again, and the night held them, as it always had, as it holds you now. Good night, good night, good night. This has been the History Podcast for Sleep. We will be here whenever you need us. The night is long and the story is never quite finished, and there is always more to say about the ordinary and the ancient and the things that connect us to each other across time. But for now, for tonight, this is enough. This is exactly enough. Sleep well. We will say, as a final note, that the historians and archaeologists who have spent their careers studying ancient Egypt have noted, almost universally, a quality in the record that is not always easy to name, but that is consistently felt. It is a quality of endurance, not the grim, effortful endurance of people who are simply surviving, but something warmer than that. The paintings in the tombs are bright. The objects left in graves are beautiful. The love poems are tender. The medical texts are practical and hopeful. The wisdom literature is thoughtful and sometimes funny. These are not the records of a people who are merely getting through their days. They are the records of a people who took their days seriously and found in them things worth noting, worth celebrating, worth preserving. And the evenings too, we can be sure, were taken seriously. Not solemnly, not with great ceremony, just seriously in the sense of being genuinely inhabited, genuinely felt, genuinely valued. The tired body welcomed home, the food eaten with real appetite, the company of family and neighbours received with real pleasure, the stars watched with real attention, the sleep entered into with real surrender. These are not small things. They are the substance of a life well lived, in any century, in any civilization, under any sky. Sleep well. The stars are out. There is one more thing worth noting before we truly fall silent. The ancient Egyptians had a concept called mat, which is often translated as truth, or justice, or cosmic order. Mat was not merely a legal or ethical concept. It was an ontological one, the idea that the universe had a right and proper order, that things had their natural places and their natural rhythms, and that the good life consisted, at least in part, of aligning oneself with that order rather than working against it. The pharaoh maintained mat on behalf of all of Egypt. The priests maintained it in the temples, and ordinary people maintained it in their daily lives by doing their work, treating others fairly, fulfilling their obligations to their families and their community and their gods. The evening in this light was not merely a rest from work, it was a completion of the day's contribution to Mat. The work had been done, the obligations had been met, the day had been what it was supposed to be, and now the evening was what it was supposed to be. The rest that followed the effort, the dark that followed the light, the stillness that followed the motion, everything in its proper order, everything as it should be. You are in your own way and in your own time, in your proper order right now. The day is done. The work is finished. The obligations are met, or they will still be there tomorrow, and either way there is nothing to be done about them in this moment. Right now, the only thing that is asked of you is the thing the body already knows how to do. The stars are out as they have always been. The night is here as it has always been, and the rest is yours as it has always been, freely given every single night, without condition, without end. Good night. The reed mats are laid out, the oil lamp is low, the bread is baked and the water is cool in the clay vessel, and the north wind moves through the village one more time before settling into stillness. The craftsman breathes, the farmer breathes, the scribe breathes, you breathe. One long, slow breath drawn in and held for just a moment and then released, all the way out, until the lungs are easy and the chest is soft and the body is ready. The night holds everything. Nothing is required now but this: the breath, the dark, the rest. Good night. Sleep deeply, sleep long.